Approximately 6 millennia before the start of the Common Era, a nomadic herdsman traveling through the scorched, sun-drenched wilderness of the Arabian Peninsula made a minor oversight. This was not a catastrophic blunder. No lives were lost and no great civilizations crumbled. This individual simply poured fresh milk into a container crafted from the stomach of a young animal, secured it to the flank of a donkey, and proceeded to walk for many hours under the unrelenting heat of the Middle Eastern sun. When the traveler finally paused to quench their thirst, the milk had vanished. In its place was a thin, watery fluid and a mass of soft, white solids resting at the bottom of the pouch. The milk had undergone curdling. The intense desert warmth, the constant agitation of the trek, and the residual natural enzymes lining the interior of that stomach bag had combined to achieve something entirely unintended. They had created cheese. What was unknown at that moment was that this small, seemingly trivial accident would outlast every empire, every faith, and every conflict that would follow in its wake. Cheese would eventually go on to sustain vast armies, underpin entire economies, trigger major scientific discoveries, and evolve into one of the most cherished foods in the history of humanity. It all began simply because someone chose the incorrect vessel for their milk. It was around 6000 BCE, and the earliest human settlements in the Fertile Crescent were just starting the process of domesticating livestock. Goats were the first, followed by sheep and then cattle. These were not dairy businesses in any modern sense of the word. Families maintained modest herds, migrated according to the seasons, and utilized every single part of the animal they possibly could. Hides were turned into shelters, bones were fashioned into tools, and stomachs were used as carrying bags. That final detail is the essential key to this entire narrative. The lining of a young ruminant's stomach contains a specific enzyme known as rennet. When fresh milk remains inside that lining and becomes warm, the rennet functions to break the milk proteins apart, causing them to bind together. The liquid that is separated during this process is known as whey. The solid matter that forms is called curd, and curd, when it is pressed and treated with salt, represents the earliest version of cheese. No one specifically engineered this process. No one sat down with the intention of figuring out how to coagulate casein proteins. It occurred by accident repeatedly across thousands of miles of ancient grazing territory. And every time it happened, someone sampled the result and realized it was not merely edible, but actually quite good. It possessed a longer shelf life than fresh milk. It was easier to transport, and it concentrated calories and fats into a dense, portable form that could sustain a family during the leanest months of the year. There is also a strong argument to be made that cheese actually played a role in human evolution. Early humans were predominantly lactose intolerant. Consuming fresh milk made them ill, but the process of making cheese removes the majority of the lactose from the milk, capturing the protein and fat within the curds while the problematic sugars are drained away with the whey. Consequently, cheese provided lactose-intolerant groups with access to the nutritional advantages of dairy without the negative digestive results. Over the course of thousands of years, populations that regularly consumed dairy products developed genetic mutations that allowed them to digest lactose even as adults. However, cheese came first. Cheese was the practical workaround that permitted humans to benefit from animal milk long before their physical bodies had adapted to drinking it in its raw form. Archaeologists have discovered remnants of cheese production on fragments of pottery dating back to approximately 5000 BCE in what is now the nation of Poland. This indicates that people were no longer just stumbling upon cheese by chance. They were actively and intentionally producing it. They had mastered the process and begun to repeat it with purpose. Clay strainers, perforated with tiny holes to separate the curds from the whey, appear in the archaeological record throughout Europe and the Middle East from this specific period. These were specialized tools designed for the sole purpose of cheesemaking. By the time the first major civilizations began to emerge in Mesopotamia, cheese had already established itself as a dietary staple. Sumerian cuneiform tablets from roughly 3500 BCE make reference to cheese and butter as common everyday goods. These were not luxury items set aside only for royalty. They were a standard part of the diet for laborers, soldiers, and farmers alike. Temple records from the ancient city of Ur describe food rations that included cheese being distributed to the workers who were constructing some of the earliest monumental structures on the planet. Thus, while those laborers were laying the very foundations of human civilization, cheese was quite literally providing the energy for the effort. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers, and their tablets reveal that cheese was not considered a single product, but rather an entire category. They made distinctions between fresh cheese and aged cheese, and between soft curds intended for immediate consumption and harder varieties that could be stored for weeks or months. Different temples maintained their own unique cheese recipes. The city of Lagash kept detailed inventories of its cheese stores in much the same way a modern logistics warehouse tracks its inventory. These were not merely casual mentions. Cheese had effectively become a form of infrastructure. In the land of ancient Egypt, the history of cheese becomes even more fascinating. Paintings found in tombs from the Old Kingdom period depict scenes of milk being poured into various vessels and processed into what appear to be varieties of soft cheese. When archaeologists performed excavations on the tomb of Thoms, a high-ranking official from the 13th century BCE, they discovered a jar that contained a solidified white substance. Scientific chemical analysis later confirmed that this was a very ancient cheese, most likely produced from a combination of cow's milk and either sheep or goat's milk. We are discussing cheese that is more than 3,000 years old, which was sealed inside a tomb as a ritual offering to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. This detail reveals a great deal about how seriously the ancient Egyptians regarded their dairy products. However, cheese was not merely a food source in the ancient world. In Greece, it took on a status that was closer to mythology. Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, which was written around the 8th century BCE, features a famous scene in which the Cyclops Polyphemus is found making cheese inside his cave. He is described as having baskets overflowing with curds and racks that are heavily loaded with aging wheels of cheese. Homer provides enough detail about the process that one could almost replicate it at home. The Greeks held the belief that cheese was a gift bestowed upon them by the gods, specifically from Aristaeus, who was the divine protector of both cheese-making and beekeeping. Ancient Greek athletes consumed cheese before competing in the original Olympic Games, believing that it provided strength to the body. Soldiers carried it with them on military campaigns across the Aegean Sea. Shepherds living on the rugged hillsides of Crete and the Peloponnese produced fresh cheese from sheep and goat milk every morning, pressing the curds into molds and aging them within clay jars that were sealed with olive oil. The island of Delos, which served as a major trading center in the ancient Aegean, became a hub for the cheese trade, with different varieties from all over the Greek world passing through its busy markets on their way to buyers in far-off cities. Cheese was deeply integrated into the daily rhythms of Greek life in a manner that extended far beyond simple nutrition. And then came the influence of Rome. If the Greeks treated cheese as a sacred tradition, the Romans approached it as a significant business opportunity. The Romans did not invent the process of cheese-making, but they did something that was arguably even more impactful. They standardized the process, they scaled it up, and they spread it throughout an empire that reached from the arid deserts of North Africa to the misty shores of Britain. Roman cheese-making techniques were documented in incredible detail by Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella, an agricultural writer from the 1st century. His work, De Re Rustica, essentially serves as the first comprehensive cheese-making manual in Western history. Columella provided descriptions of how to curdle milk using rennet, how to press the resulting curds into molds, how to use salt to preserve the cheese, and how to age it in environments that were cool and dry. He was very specific regarding timing, temperature, and technical methods in a way that would seem quite familiar to any artisan cheesemaker working in the present day. 2,000 years later, the Roman military utilized cheese as a standard field ration for its troops. Legionnaires who were marching across Gaul, Iberia, and Germania carried hard, aged cheese in their packs because it could be kept for several months without spoiling. Consider that for a moment. The same empire that constructed massive aqueducts, invented the use of concrete, and built a road network that spanned over 250,000 miles was also powering its territorial expansion with cheese. Wherever the Roman legions traveled, the practice of cheese-making followed. Local populations acquired Roman techniques, adapted them to their own available milk sources in local climates, and created regional cheese varieties that continue to exist today. Roman trade networks also transformed cheese into one of the ancient world's first branded luxury products. Pliny the Elder, writing during the 1st century, ranked various cheeses from across the empire in a way that a modern food critic might rank high-end restaurants. He offered praise for a smoked cheese from the city of Velabrum. He described cheeses from Gaul that were noted for being tangy and strong. He also observed that cheese from the Alpine regions of what is now Switzerland was especially highly prized in the city of Rome. The wealthy elite served imported cheeses at their banquets as a sign of their sophistication. Meanwhile, the poor consumed locally produced fresh cheese as a daily dietary staple. Cheese had become stratified into both a basic necessity and a high-end luxury, and the Romans were perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. They collected taxes on it regardless of its status. This is the point where the story takes a turn that no one truly expected. When the Roman Empire eventually collapsed during the 5th century, one might assume that the art of cheesemaking would have collapsed along with it. Roads fell into disrepair, trade routes were severed, and cities began to shrink. Europe entered a period that historians sometimes refer to as the Dark Ages, characterized by political fragmentation, economic decline, and a retreat of culture. However, cheese did not vanish. It survived, and the reason for its survival represents one of the most unusual chapters in the history of food. Monasteries were the ones who saved cheese. Following the fall of Rome, Christian monasteries became the primary intellectual and agricultural hubs of medieval Europe. Monks were responsible for preserving Roman texts, maintaining productive farms, and developing innovative techniques for everything from brewing beer to growing crops. They dedicated themselves to the craft of cheesemaking with a level of commitment one would expect from individuals who had taken solemn vows of discipline and patience. If there is one thing that the production of cheese requires above all else, it is patience. Benedictine and Cistercian monks in particular became legendary for their skills as cheesemakers. They conducted experiments with various aging techniques, learning how different levels of temperature and humidity impacted the flavor and texture of the cheese over the course of months or even years. They pioneered the practice of washing the rinds of cheese with brine or alcohol, which encouraged the growth of specific bacteria on the surface and resulted in the creation of entirely new flavor profiles. They carved out storage caves from hillsides and cliff faces, utilizing the naturally cool and humid underground environments to age large wheels of cheese slowly and with consistency. The results of these medieval monastic experiments can still be found on store shelves today. Roquefort, which is one of the most famous blue cheeses in the world, can trace its origins back to the caves of southern France. There, monks aged cheese made from sheep's milk and noticed that a specific type of mold growing within the cave created distinctive blue veins and a sharp, tangy taste. Rather than fighting the mold, the monks embraced it. Parmigiano Reggiano, the hard Italian cheese that people all over the world grate over their pasta, was first produced by Benedictine monks in the Emilia-Romagna region around the 13th century. Gouda was developed in the Netherlands, while Gruyere originated in the Swiss Alps. Each of these famous cheeses was the product of a specific combination of local milk, regional climate, and the tireless experimentation of monastic communities who had an abundance of time and devotion. The monks also discovered something that modern food scientists would not fully comprehend until centuries later. The bacteria and molds that developed on the cheese during the aging process were not merely for decoration. They were actively breaking down proteins and fats into smaller, more flavorful chemical compounds. The longer a cheese was aged under the proper conditions, the more complex its flavor profile became. This explains why a fresh mozzarella and a 3-year-old Parmigiano taste like entirely different foods, despite the fact that they both begin as cow's milk. Time, bacteria, and the environment do the heavy lifting. The monks figured this out through sheer patience and repetition, maintaining meticulous records of what worked and passing that knowledge down through generations of monastic life. During this period, cheese also became a recognized form of currency. In many regions of medieval Europe, farmers paid their taxes and their rent using wheels of cheese instead of coins. Monasteries accumulated massive stores of it. Markets began to emerge in towns across France, England, and the Low Countries specifically for the purpose of trading cheese. The entire economic structure of certain regions was built around the production of dairy and the aging of cheese. In some Swiss and Italian mountain communities, a family's wealth was literally measured by the number of wheels of aging cheese they had stored away in their cellar. Pay close attention to this next detail because it explains how cheese became a global phenomenon. The age of exploration changed the world of cheese forever. When European ships began to cross the Atlantic Ocean in the late 1400s, they carried more than just gold seekers and missionaries. They carried cattle. And wherever cattle went, milk was sure to follow. And where there was milk, cheese was never far behind. Spanish colonists introduced dairy cattle to the Caribbean in Central America during the early 1500s. English settlers who arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1620s brought entire herds across the Atlantic, along with the cheese-making knowledge that their families had practiced for many generations. Dutch colonists who settled in New Amsterdam, which we now know as New York, brought their traditions of Gouda and Edam with them. French settlers in Quebec carried the soft cheese techniques of Normandy and Brittany into the wilderness of Canada. Cheese was the ideal food for the process of colonization. It could last for months without the need for refrigeration. It provided a dense source of calories and protein in a compact form. Furthermore, it could be produced anywhere that one had access to milk, salt, and some basic equipment. On long ocean voyages that could last for weeks or even months, barrels of hard cheese kept crews alive when fresh food supplies were exhausted. Ship manifests from the 16th and 17th centuries list cheese alongside hardtack, salted meat, and dried beans as essential provisions. The harder and drier the cheese was, the longer it would last at sea. Wheels of aged Edam, coated in wax to protect them against moisture and mold, were particularly popular on Dutch trading vessels crossing the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Some of those wax-sealed wheels survived voyages of 6 months or more, arriving at distant ports still edible and still valuable as trade goods. The same cheese that had once fueled Roman legions as they marched across Europe was now fueling European ships as they sailed across the world's oceans. By the 1700s, cheese-making in the American colonies had developed into a serious cottage industry. Nearly every farm produced its own supply of cheese. Regional styles began to emerge based on local cattle breeds, the climate, and family traditions. Cheddar, which originally came from the English village of Cheddar in Somerset, became the dominant style in New England and the mid-Atlantic states. In Vermont, families aged sharp cheddars in cool cellars throughout the winter. In New York, communities influenced by the Dutch produced softer and milder varieties. However, everything was still operating on a small scale. A single family might produce only a few dozen wheels of cheese per season. Distribution was strictly local, and the quality varied wildly from one farm to the next. Cheese remained fundamentally an artisan product made by hand in kitchens and barns across the countryside. By the middle of the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution had already transformed the production of textiles, the smelting of iron, and the methods of transportation. It was about to do the exact same thing to the world of cheese. In 1851, a dairy farmer named Jesse Williams in Oneida County, New York, did something that no one had ever attempted before. He convinced his neighbors to bring their milk to his farm, where he would produce cheese for all of them using a standardized process in a single purpose-built facility. Jesse Williams had just invented the cheese factory. Within a decade, hundreds of cheese factories were in operation across New York, Wisconsin, and Ohio. Milk from dozens or even hundreds of different farms was pooled together and processed under one roof, using consistent techniques that resulted in a uniform product. Cheese transitioned from being a handmade farm good with unpredictable quality to a manufactured commodity that could be produced at a massive scale and shipped across the country by rail. Then came the influence of Louis Pasteur. In the 1860s, the French chemist demonstrated that heating liquids to a specific temperature could kill off harmful bacteria without destroying the liquid itself. Pasteurization, as the process came to be known, was originally developed for the wine industry, but dairy producers were quick to adopt it. Pasteurized milk was safer, it lasted longer, and it produced cheese with much more predictable results. It also meant that large-scale factories could process enormous volumes of milk without the constant risk of contamination that had plagued smaller operations. The same principles that built Jesse Williams' first factory were now being scaled across entire continents. Cheese factories opened in England, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Australia. By the early 1900s, cheese production had become a genuine industry with dedicated supply chains, specialized equipment, and branded products competing for market share. The speed of this transformation was truly staggering. In 1860, the majority of cheese in America was still being made on individual farms. By 1900, factory-produced cheese accounted for the vast majority of the total output. Wisconsin, with its cold climate, abundant grazing land, and waves of German and Scandinavian immigrants who brought dairy expertise from Europe, emerged as the cheese capital of America. The state earned the nickname America's Dairyland, and it was not an exaggeration. Wisconsin was producing more cheese than some entire European nations. And then James L. Kraft changed everything once again. In 1916, the Canadian-born entrepreneur living in Chicago patented a method for processing cheese by heating it with an emulsifying salt. The result was a smooth, uniform, and shelf-stable product that could be sliced, wrapped, and sold in individual portions. Kraft processed cheese did not taste like Roquefort or Parmigiano Reggiano. It tasted like convenience, and the American public loved it. During World War I, the United States military ordered over 6 million pounds of Kraft processed cheese to feed its troops overseas. It did not require refrigeration, it did not spoil, and it could be shipped in tin cans to battlefields across France and Belgium. After the war, Kraft expanded into the retail market, placing his processed cheese into grocery stores across America. By the 1950s, Kraft singles, those individually wrapped slices of orange processed cheese, had become a staple of the American kitchen. Whether people loved them or hated them, they were everywhere. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Industrial cheese was inexpensive, consistent, and available to everyone. Supermarket dairy aisles offered dozens of options in neat plastic packaging. The small family cheesemakers, who had once defined the industry, faded into the background. Cheese had been democratized, made accessible to every household in the developed world. However, that did not last. By the 1970s and 80s, a backlash was beginning to build. Food writers, chefs, and consumers started asking an uncomfortable question. Why did so much cheese taste like nothing? The industrialization that had made cheese affordable had also stripped away much of what made it interesting. Pasteurization killed harmful bacteria, but it also killed the wild microbes that gave traditional cheeses their complex and distinctive flavors. Factory standardization produced consistency, but at the cost of character. In France, this tension had been simmering for decades. The French appellation system, which protected the names and production methods of traditional cheeses, had been established as early as 1925 for Roquefort. By the late 20th century, similar protections existed for hundreds of European cheeses, from Stilton in England to Manchego in Spain to Feta in Greece. These designations were not just about branding. They were about preserving techniques that stretched back centuries, sometimes all the way to those medieval monasteries. And then something unexpected happened on the other side of the Atlantic. America, the country that had given the world Kraft singles and Cheese Whiz, started making world-class artisan cheese. In Vermont, small dairies began producing aged cheddars that could compete with anything from Somerset. In California, cheesemakers experimented with goat and sheep milk cheeses inspired by French and Italian traditions. In Wisconsin, a new generation of producers combined old-world techniques with American innovation to create entirely new styles that won international awards. This was not a niche trend. The American artisan cheese movement exploded from a handful of producers in the 1980s to over 1,000 by the 2000s. Small creameries in Oregon, Wisconsin, and Virginia started winning major international competitions, beating European entries from countries with centuries more cheesemaking history. Rogue River Blue, a cheese from southern Oregon wrapped in grape leaves soaked in pear brandy, won the World Cheese Awards in 2019, becoming the first American cheese to take the top prize. The announcement sent shockwaves through the European cheese establishment. America, the land of Velveeta and spray cheese, had just produced the best cheese on the planet. Cheese shops opened in cities across the country. Farmers' markets featured local cheesemakers selling wheels aged in nearby caves and cellars. The same country that had industrialized cheese more aggressively than any other was now leading a global revival of handmade small batch production. But this wasn't just about America. Around the world, cheese had become a cultural phenomenon that crossed every border and tradition. Japan, a country with virtually no historical cheese culture, became one of the fastest growing cheese markets on earth. Annual cheese consumption in Japan more than doubled between the 1990s and the 2020s, driven by Western influence, fusion cuisine, and a genuine love for the product. India developed its own massive dairy industry centered around paneer, a fresh cheese that became the cornerstone of vegetarian cooking across the subcontinent. Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico all built thriving cheese cultures that blended European techniques with indigenous ingredients and local tastes. The World Championship Cheese Contest, held every 2 years in Wisconsin, draws entries from over 30 countries and judges thousands of cheeses across more than 100 categories. Winning a gold medal at this competition can transform a small dairy's business overnight. In Europe, the World Cheese Awards perform a similar function, with thousands of entries from dozens of nations competing for recognition. Cheese has its own celebrity culture now, with master cheesemakers, affineurs who specialize in aging, and cheesemongers who curate selections the way sommeliers curate wine lists. Today, the global cheese industry produces over 22 million metric tons of cheese every single year. The United States, Germany, France, and Italy are the largest producers. The European Union alone exports billions of dollars worth of cheese annually. Mozzarella is the most produced cheese in the world, driven largely by the global pizza industry, which consumes staggering quantities of it every day. Cheddar holds the second spot, followed by a rotating cast of regional favorites, depending on which country you're looking at. Cheese caves still dot the hillsides of central France, aging wheels of Comte and Beaufort in the same cool darkness that monks discovered 1,000 years ago. In the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, banks accept wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano as collateral for loans, storing them in climate-controlled vaults where they age for years, appreciating in value like fine art. A single wheel of high-quality Parmigiano can be worth over $1,000. In Sardinia, shepherds still make pecorino by hand from the milk of free-ranging sheep grazing on wild herbs and grasses, using methods that have barely changed since the Roman Republic. And at the same time, a factory in Wisconsin can produce 50,000 pounds of cheese in a single day using computerized systems that monitor every variable from moisture content to bacterial culture levels. Those two realities exist side by side: ancient craft and industrial scale, a shepherd in the mountains, and a factory floor the size of a football field, both of them making cheese, both of them feeding the world. The real question about cheese is not how it was invented. That part was an accident. The question is why it endured. Why, out of every food that humans stumbled onto in the ancient world, did this one become so universal? Why did it outlast the empires that adopted it, survive the collapse of the civilizations that spread it, and thrive in the modern world alongside every technological revolution that tried to replace handmade food with something faster and cheaper? Part of the answer is practical. Cheese solves a problem that never went away. Milk spoils. It always has. And for thousands of years before refrigerators and pasteurization and cold supply chains, turning milk into cheese was the only reliable way to preserve its calories and nutrients for more than a few days. Cheese was a survival technology before it was a culinary tradition. It kept families alive through winters when fresh food was scarce. It kept soldiers marching when supply lines were stretched thin. It gave farming communities a way to store the value of their herds in a form that could be traded, taxed, saved, and eaten months or even years later. And when the survival need faded, when refrigeration made fresh milk available year-round and global supply chains made fresh food accessible in every season, cheese did not fade with it. Because somewhere along the way, cheese had become more than a preservation method. It had become a pleasure. The sharp bite of an aged cheddar, the creamy softness of a ripe brie, the salty crumble of feta over a salad, the stretchy pull of mozzarella on a hot pizza. These are not survival strategies. They are experiences. And billions of people around the world choose them every single day, not because they have to, but because they want to. But the other part of the answer is cultural. Cheese is endlessly adaptable. Every region that adopted it made it their own. The French turned it into an art form with hundreds of name varieties, each tied to a specific place and tradition. The Italians made it the backbone of one of the world's great cuisines. The Swiss built an identity around it. The Americans industrialized it, mass-produced it, and then turned around and reinvented it as a craft product. The Japanese discovered it and fell in love with it on their own terms. Cheese does not demand loyalty to any single tradition. It absorbs the character of wherever it lands. That is the legacy of the nomadic herder's accident. One moment of spoiled milk in a goatskin bag 7,000 years ago became a tradition that survived the rise and fall of Mesopotamia, the glory of Greece, the expansion of Rome, the silence of the Dark Ages, the ambition of European colonization, the roar of the Industrial Revolution, and the frantic pace of the modern global economy. Cheese did not just survive all of that. It thrived through every single chapter, and it is still going. Somewhere right now in a cave in southern France, a wheel of Roquefort is slowly developing the blue veins that have defined it for centuries. Somewhere in Vermont, a cheesemaker is turning this morning's milk into curds by hand. Somewhere in Tokyo, someone is tasting European-style cheese for the first time and falling in love with it. And somewhere in a factory that stretches across an industrial park, machines are producing the mozzarella that will end up on a pizza box delivered to a doorstep tonight. All of it traces back to one accident in one desert thousands of years ago. If this exploration of how a simple accident transformed the culinary world has changed the way you look at the dairy in your fridge, please subscribe to our channel. We are uncovering the hidden histories that have shaped our modern lives. Join us as we dig deeper into the past to understand our future. Our next historical treasure will be revealed very soon. Don't forget to like this video to help others discover these stories.